Hello, friends, and welcome back to another edition of our NBA Insider video live stream notebook right here on the one and only Bleacher Report app. And we thank you, as always, to those who tune in on YouTube as well. My name is Jake Fischer, your resident NBA Insider for all things Bleacher Report. It is Tuesday, December 9th, 5 p.m. Eastern Time. We are less than a week away from December 15th, which is the unofficial / official start of NBA trade season. That's when the majority of players like Chris Paul, who signed as free agents this past summer, who signed new contracts, will become eligible for trade. And the 15th is also the deadline for a player to be traded and then be able to be reaggregated and traded with other contracts before the trade deadline, the day before the trade deadline, or the trade deadline. That was a big detail. If you remember a year ago when Golden State traded for Dennis Schroeder first from Brooklyn, and they traded him again to Miami for Jimmy Butler. And Miami is a great place to start because that is one of the teams that we are monitoring as a potential Giannis Antetokounmpo landing spot. And where the Greek Freak could ultimately go once he and his representation, Alex Saratzis of Octagon Sports, eventually come to some type of quote unquote resolution with Bucks management, that the entire NBA is expecting Giannis Antetokounmpo is going to be available for trade between December 15th and the trade deadline ultimately on February 5th. There's been a lot of veiled language dating back to this past summer about Giannis wanting to take some time and wanting to evaluate things and wanting to ultimately figure out whether or not the Bucks are his best opportunity at winning a second championship. But I'd say overall, from my conversations with people around the league, with people around Milwaukee, with people around the Antetokounmpo brothers, that the writing is on the wall, and we are in this position right now because Antetokounmpo's agent, Alex Saratzis, told the Bucks this past summer that they were going to reevaluate things about 20 games into the year, and that's where we're at. And the Bucks are looking up at the majority of the Eastern Conference playoff picture. They have been porous, to say the least, when Antetokounmpo has been out this season, and he is, of course, still on the sidelines right now, nursing a calf strain, where we don't know when Giannis will be back on the floor, and obviously that is going to do no service for the Bucks in their effort to win more games and to continue to shape into a legitimate championship contender in the Eastern Conference. So where could we see Giannis go? We talked about Miami. That is something that has been on the Giannis radar, the periphery, since 2020, when Giannis was considering opting out of an extension opportunity with the Bucks before the Bucks went out and traded Jrue Holiday, and then the rest was history. But Miami, in addition to Dallas, back when they had Luka Doncic, those were two spots that Giannis had his eyes set on as a potential next stop for him. Again, back in 2020. You flash forward to this past summer, and it was all about New York. I wrote over the weekend at the Stein Line, my joint Substack effort with the Hall of Famer Mark Stein. If you're not subscribed to us right now, you want to get in there. We're going to be doing our weekly video live stream notebooks right here. But if you want detailed written intel about all things NBA trade action, we're going to be coming to you multiple times a week on the Stein Line, markstein.substack.com. And we did a deep dive into Miami, all of a sudden shaping into a potential buyer this trade deadline season because they've had more success than they anticipated. And depending on their ability to trade Terry Rozier, they have various contracts from Andrew Wiggins to Tyler Hero and 2 first-round draft picks to make some moves. But will that be enough to get into a proverbial Giannis sweepstakes? Because as Two-Way Prophet is saying in the chat, if you were to trade Giannis to the Rockets, then the Bucks would have theoretically a pick of Amen Thompson, Jabari Smith Jr., Alperen Şengün. There'd be plenty of interesting blue chip players that Houston could potentially send out the door. And the Rockets were a team that we were told were monitoring Giannis and waiting to make a big splash to go get a player like him. But that was before Kevin Durant. So I'd be curious to really see what the Rockets' ultimate appetite would be to sacrificing more for win now moves after the trade that sent Dylan Brooks and Jalen Green and the number 10 pick to Phoenix for Kevin Durant. Should San Antonio test the waters for Giannis? Jay Papp wants to know. And that has, of course, been a very popular destination and potential suitor that people have talked about ever since the Spurs jumped back in the draft lottery in May and got the number 2 pick. And there was immediate discussion around the league about would you trade that number 2 pick for Giannis? Back then, that was not something the Spurs wanted to do. The Spurs were adamant that they were keeping that number 2 selection and they were going to take Dylan Harper. I truly don't know at this juncture whether that stance has changed, whether it will change with how well the Spurs are playing, even without Victor Wembanyama. I'm in Los Angeles. I'm here hoping that we'll see him tomorrow night, Wednesday, against the Lakers in the NBA Cup quarterfinal. But they are still right in the thick of every team chasing that 2 seed behind Oklahoma City in the Western Conference. So does San Antonio see this as an opportunity to really push their chips in the table after doing so a little bit already to acquire De'Aaron Fox before last year's trade deadline? That would be a very fascinating wrinkle because the Spurs definitely between Steph Castle, between Dylan Harper, between a bounty of other draft picks, they've got the salary and Harrison Barnes to and Kelly Olynyk to go out and really start to match a maximum level contract as well. But that is the question in the West. How good will you ultimately be in comparison to OKC? That's what every team is going to ask. And to K Polk 7 asking, do I see OKC making a play for Giannis? I really don't. The Thunder are so far ahead of their conference, and they are, last I looked, they were 7 points per 100 possessions better than any other defense in the NBA. They are absolutely putting on a clinic as reigning champs right now. And I don't see them, even though they have the draft capital as much as anyone to go out there and get anybody. I don't see them making a play for Giannis Antetokounmpo right now. I don't see the Thunder making a play for Giannis. I don't see them making a play for anyone really of significant impact. And I wonder if any team will ultimately think that John Morant could be someone that makes a significant impact for them if they were to pursue the Memphis guard and try to really rehabilitate him as an all-star and reclaim his, next future face of the league type of status that he was at before injuries and off-court stuff really took everything in Memphis sideways. Now, I've written over the weekend at the Steinline that the Miami Heat have internally discussed whether or not that their vaunted Heat culture and infrastructure could be beneficial for John Morant. I do not think that there has been significant conversation between the two teams because, to be clear, Memphis has pushed back on any incoming trade inquiry about John Morant to this juncture. The Grizzlies have swatted away all those calls and asks about what it would take to get for him. But that doesn't mean that other teams aren't calling and aren't preparing and figuring out what their offer could look like, what it should look like, and what he would look like next to whatever their current returning situation would be. And Miami, to my understanding, has definitely spoken internally and told other teams that they believe they could be a really good situation for John Morant if he were to find a new home outside of Memphis. Ethan 12 is asking, are the Bulls an option for John Morant? And that's something I have not heard and I don't expect to hear because Chicago really has handed their keys over to Josh Giddey. And they have obviously stumbled out after a strong 6-1 start, but they have another point guard situation to consider with Kobe White moving forward. He's going to want a big payday. I just don't see them moving off of Kobe White for someone that is even more volatile than his playing status. And by Kobe White's volatility, I mean more so his availability due to injury. But I don't see John Morant being someone that they want to splurge for. The team that we've really heard to keep an eye on for John Morant, in addition to Miami, has been Minnesota. The Wolves, by various accounts, have been poking around the point guard market, and that's something I want to ask more on in the coming days and weeks. But that's kind of really been the limited situation for a potential John Morant trade sweepstakes because he hasn't really played up to par of an all-star maximum salary contract player, both defensively and with his shooting efficiencies, and he's been injured. He's been inconsistent. And from the get-go of this season, with his breakdown with head coach Thomas Isolo, I've heard from rival teams that they're maybe even more concerned about Morant's health and his ability to stay on the floor than anything else. And that's something that I think will plague LaMelo Ball's potential trade candidacy, something that will impact Trae Young's trade value as well. And it will be interesting to see if that ultimately is why the Grizzlies don't have John Morant trade conversations in earnest this year, because they will probably understand and recognize, just like I am from my hotel room right here, and not intimately involved in the conversations that Memphis is having with other teams, that the value for Ja right now will pale in comparison to what it would have ranked a time ago. And it's difficult in the NBA to do business at a lower cost than what you know that player should theoretically be able to draw in a better scenario. Off topic from JJ, but Kuminga didn't play during the Bulls game. Will they explore trading him before the deadline? There's been a bunch of Warriors questions in the chat, so happy to get to this one from JJ because, yes, at this point in time, I think the overwhelming expectation is that Golden State is going to peruse the trade value for Jonathan Kuminga. And this was kind of by design all along, short of an absolute just home run season for Kuminga. The Warriors wanted to sign him to a 2-year deal with a team option that would have made him very trade eligible this season. He will not be trade eligible until January 15th. So this December 15th unofficial trade window doesn't factor Jonathan Kuminga into it right now. But come January 15th, Jonathan Kuminga will be eligible to be dealt. And I absolutely expect the Warriors to canvass the league and throw myriad options on their own internal whiteboards to see what his $22.5 million salary for this season could go out and match. A name we've heard from them or for Golden State that they've had their sights set on for some time now has been Trey Murphy in New Orleans. Miles Turner, I think, is a little bit of a less hand in glove fit there, someone that the Warriors have looked at in the past. And if Giannis does end up having a trade request and the Bucks move on from him, there's definitely an expectation from some teams. Now it depends, if the Bucks get back a blue chip player that they think keeps them kind of relevant and someone in the playoff picture, it'll be different. But I think a lot of teams expect that if they make a move for Giannis, that Miles Turner, Kyle Kuzma, Bobby Portis, whoever, will also be for the taking. And I think Miles Turner would be an interesting salary fit. He just would be. He's basically at this stage of their respective careers. Miles Turner is a younger, less expensive, or less. He makes more, but he's just a younger floor spacing center than Al Horford, and kind of fits that exact archetype in the front court that Golden State was looking for when they made that move this past summer. Let's go to Los Angeles now, where one player that could potentially get moved right away on December 15th. I haven't heard of anything imminent, to be clear, but Chris Paul has obviously already been sent home from the Clippers after his leadership style and a lot of discontent in Los Angeles flared up to the nth degree on a road trip last week where, look, from my conversations, the Clippers were very clear with Chris Paul from the get-go this past summer that he was going to be a reserve guard on this team, that him and Chris Dunn were going to be doing all of the secondary point guard table setting behind James Harden this season. Chris Paul was a part of that rotation when the Clippers started the season 3-2. Then all of a sudden, he's out of the rotation. The Clippers start losing and losing and losing. And he was no longer a tenable voice in that locker room, someone who was frustrated about his lack of playing time And it got to the point where the Clippers thought it was best to part ways with him and send him home immediately. But the fact that Chris Paul is such a legend of this franchise, the Clippers are very sensitive to this situation and they want to help make sure that Chris Paul gets to a new situation where he'll be happy and content because this is supposed to be his last season. Remember, he announced it on Instagram that this was going to be his final campaign and his final go around the NBA. So where could that be? Because it's not going to be with the Clippers. The easiest scenario for the Clippers to part ways with Chris Paul officially and to move him to a new situation would be to just directly trade him for another player making a veteran minimum salary. Because the Clippers are just over $1 million below the first apron, and they cannot just waive Chris Paul and add someone else that would first put them past the first apron, which they are hard capped at. And the Clippers are also currently only at 14 players or 15 players, excuse me. And there's a small provision in the CBA where the NBA requires teams to have 14 players on the roster. There's a 2 week grace period you're allowed, but after that, you have to sign someone. And the Clippers just don't have the salary wiggle room to do that. So the simplest solution would be to trade him straight up for a veteran minimum player. Where that could be, again, this is going to be a situation where the Clippers are going to work with Chris Paul and his representation at CAA. So in the summer, he definitely had interest from the Knicks. He had interest from Milwaukee. That situation, of course, has gone completely haywire with everything with Giannis. I'm seeing Mason Miller in the chat saying, OKC, run it back from the bubble days, get him a ring. I mean, that would be surely Chris Paul's easiest pathway to finding a championship contending roster. I have not heard anything there. I I don't know, truth be told, if the Thunder would want to introduce a potential volatile personality into how well everything's rocking on that ship right now. But there was definitely some interest with Minnesota as well. And we talked about that in the John Morant discussion, the last segment, that the Wolves are supposed to be factoring into the point guard market. They just inserted Bones Highland into the lineup to try and reinvigorate that offense. So maybe Chris Paul could have some opportunities there. But it seems clear he's going to want to go somewhere where he can play because that was not the situation with the Clippers. And he got upset to the point where him acting out or whatever you want to call it got him off the team. So he's definitely, I think, going to be wanting a situation where he'll be able to have some playing time pretty immediately. Hayden wants to know outside of CP3 or other Clippers on the move, Harden, Kawhi. I know a lot of teams are going to call and have been calling on Ivica Zubac, but to my understanding, the Clippers don't have any interest at this juncture, and it's early. It's only December 9th. So who's to say, as poor as the Clippers continue to fall, that maybe they'll reevaluate things. But I have been given every indication, as Sam Amick said today on the Run It Back show on FanDuel TV, that the Clippers want to ride this group out. And part of it too is the fact that the Clippers have been preserving spending ability and salary cap space in 2027 dating back to the 2023-24 season when they made that extension, that 3-year extension with Kawhi, and they told Paul George and his representation, we're not going beyond that 3-year deal either, because they wanted to get back out into free agency like they did in 2019 when they added Kawhi Leonard and Paul George. They're not going to have nearly the draft capital now because of what they sent out in that Paul George blockbuster that helped them deliver Kawhi and Paul in lockstep. So in theory, I could understand why trading James Harden and Kawhi Leonard both could net back some significant draft capital that the Clippers need. However, they have been so committed to those two guys since Harden has arrived and to Kawhi from the beginning, and they want to win games. They don't stand to benefit for selling and tanking because their pick goes to Oklahoma City no matter what. So I do think the Clippers will maybe even potentially be a buyer compared to being a seller. They've got, John Collins' salary to potentially play with. They've got some other mid-tier movable salaries. And I think that the Clippers are far more likely to try to compete and sneak their way into the playoffs by way of the play-in far more than they're going to sell. Again, at this juncture, it's early, things could change, but I'm not expecting anyone to be, fire sold in the Clippers situation right now. One more Giannis question. Chief Gio says, could I see Giannis working out with Trey in Atlanta? Would they have to give up Johnson? The Hawks have an interesting potential package for Milwaukee because they've got the Pelicans pick and the most favorable of that pick and the Bucks own pick. So in theory, they could send that number one pick that right to Milwaukee and have the Bucks start over all over again. Jalen Johnson is a Wisconsin native, so I'm sure the Bucks would be super excited about bringing him in. But Atlanta has looked at Jalen Johnson, Dyson Daniels, and Zach Richardson as this next, iteration of the Hawks, potentially even beyond Trae Young. If anything, I think Atlanta would be trying to get Giannis Antetokounmpo without sending Jalen Johnson out and putting Trae Young in. So I don't think that you're getting a world where you're getting Trae and Giannis. You also probably need to put Trae out if you're the Hawks from a salary matching standpoint as well. There's a lot of salary to be matched for the Kings veterans and any potential trade that would send out Domantas Sabonis, Zach LaVine, or DeMar DeRozan. DeRozan is probably the most movable of those guys because he is in an expiring deal around $22 million. I do not think of him as someone for a Jonathan Kuminga trade, but the Kings certainly have interest in Kuminga, and they're going to call. They know that Golden State has liked Keon Ellis in the past, so there'll be some situations there. But you see DeMar DeRozan, $24 million on his salary. Domantas Sabonis makes $40 million, and that is just a number that I think is going to be hard for several teams to rationalize, being that he is not an elite rim protector and he is not a three-point shooter. But the center market is starting to get interesting. We reported today that the Indiana Pacers are going to be shopping for big men. We're going to talk about this in our final segment about Anthony Davis, but Toronto, I think, is shaping into a buyer as well. And Domas behind Anthony Davis is probably the best center on the market. And his $40 million salary by comparison to Anthony Davis is actually somewhat interesting, being that Davis is going to be eligible for a major contract extension, and he's going to be wanting to get that. His agent, Rich Paul at Clutch Sports, wherever Anthony Davis ends up finishing this season, he is going to be asking for a contract extension that's going to pay Anthony Davis over $70 million moving forward all the way through his age 37 season. And that's something that a lot of teams are going to be scared away from, and what could ultimately make Domantas Sabonis and his $40 million salary a little bit more appealing, even though he is not the rim protector. He is not the three-point shooter. He's not the mid-range shooter that teams would hope he would be, that you would hope any modern-day center would be, as much as Domas is an elite dribble handoff creator, passer, etc. Jay Porter is saying the Bucks should trade Miles Turner for Sabonis. That's an interesting thought that I haven't had. I don't necessarily see that because, again, the shooting piece was a super critical component for why Milwaukee targeted Miles Turner as a Brook Lopez replacement. The Bucks have always liked Miles Turner and his ability to stretch the floor around Giannis and Giannis's bulldozes to the rim. So Sabonis being there, excuse me, Sabonis being there, I think would be a tricky fit. Bala Leach says the Dubs should look at Zach LaVine. Now, Golden State did look at Zach LaVine a year ago. To my understanding, the Warriors were looking at Zach LaVine and Nikola Vucevic from Chicago before LaVine was routed to Sacramento in that three-team deal that brought De'Aaron Fox to San Antonio. But the Warriors moved forward and they went with Jimmy Butler. And I just don't see Golden State liking Zach LaVine to the point that they would sacrifice Jimmy Butler for him or Draymond Green for him. And you basically would have to get to Zach LaVine's near $40 million salary. The only player I think in the league that Golden State would be willing to move Draymond Green for would be Giannis Antetokounmpo. That's the only player. Between him and Jonathan Kuminga and Brandon Podziemski, all of a sudden, Golden State probably does have an intriguing package if you're Milwaukee. But I don't think that they are going to be pushing Draymond's salary onto the table or Jimmy Butler's salary for anyone short of him. I don't think they are. I saw in the comment, I don't think they're making Larry Markkinen a move either. His contract is so big, and that would require you parting ways with Draymond. And I just think Golden State values him too much, and they would not part ways with Draymond Green unless it was for Giannis, and that's really it. Elsewhere in Sacramento, I mean, Keon Ellis is going to have a ton of interest, already does. And I'm curious to see what the Kings will do with him because he's only 25 years old. He would theoretically be someone you'd want to have as a two-way defensive force next to whatever draft pick you have this year with Keegan Murray, with Nick Clifford. But he's extension eligible himself in March, and they might decide that trading, getting a first round pick for an undrafted guy is ultimately worthwhile. The last thing on Golden State and Sacramento for now, I saw the chat talking about Anthony Davis for the Warriors, and that's just not something that I am really seeing. I think Golden State will look in the big man market, but again, that salary figure for Anthony Davis is going to be so expensive, and I think it would cost the Warriors too much. But we were told today, oh, LaMelo Ball was what I want to also get to. I don't think Sacramento really is interested in LaMelo Ball. I think everything Scott Perry has talked about privately and publicly since he's taken over this team is wanting to reestablish a tough, gritty identity. And someone today I was speaking to this morning on the phone called LaMelo Ball the most unserious player in the NBA. That's not my opinion. That was one prominent cat person in the NBA. I don't think Sacramento would view LaMelo Ball as someone to really reinvigorate their culture behind. To Anthony Davis, our final segment here, there was reporting from ESPN this morning that there are three teams to monitor for Anthony Davis: Detroit, Atlanta, and Toronto. And not to pour cold water on someone else's work, but I'm going to say right now that I find the Pistons to be an incredibly unlikely landing spot for Anthony Davis. We talked about this with Larry Markkinen a couple weeks ago. The fact the Pistons are out in front of the Eastern Conference, top in the standings, and they've got tradable salary with Tobias Harris, with Karis LeVert, with Duncan Robinson. They've got draft picks. They've got young players like Jaden Ivey that aren't re-signed. They could get in the mix for theoretically anyone. They've got cap space and wiggle room with the full mid-level traded player exception. But the Pistons know that Asar Thompson's coming up in extension conversations next year, that Jalen Duren is going to want, north of $40 million this summer. I don't see them wanting to put Anthony Davis's $70 million on their cap sheet, knowing that they're going to have to pay Duren and Asar Thompson and whoever. Roaring Obsidian says he likes Toronto for AD. And the Raptors, I think, are absolutely a team that will look to buy, as they did a year ago with Brandon Ingram. Their front court situation, I mean, they love Jakob Poeltl there. They always have. But if you could fortify that with someone like Anthony Davis, that'd be very fascinating to me. I haven't necessarily heard Toronto myself, but I have heard them looking at some other centers that I want to work on confirming for you guys at a later date. Hayden said, are there 80 Chicago rumors still in play? I think the Bulls have absolutely talked about making moves on Anthony Davis and Domantas Sabonis himself. Arturas Karnisovas, the GM there, is Lithuanian, just like Sabonis is. Adam T2R9T, the Mavs are good with AD. They're not going to give him up like everyone thinks. I agree. The Mavericks are only going to be moving on from Anthony Davis for a significant package. So with Atlanta, I think the Hawks dynamic, they obviously made a big move for Kristaps Porzingis this past summer, hoping he'd be a real starting level caliber center for them like he was for Boston in that championship run. But health has been a concern and an issue for him in Atlanta, just like everywhere else. And I just don't see Dallas wanting to take Kristaps' salary back. I mean, he's an expiring contract, so that could, help the Mavericks reset their books a little bit. But I just don't see an expiring as something that the Mavericks would want for Anthony Davis. I think they'd want value as opposed to just salary cap clearing situations, unless Atlanta is putting that number one pick on the table. But from my understanding, the Hawks are going to have a very, very high threshold of parting ways with the pick they got from the Pelicans in that Derek Queen trade. And I don't think Anthony Davis is going to be the player at 32 years old wanting a new payday that they are going to mortgage that pick for. So that is going to do it for today's show. I saw Ghost 316 and Asing talking about what we just discussed, that Detroit and AD. I mean, I don't think that AD makes sense salary wise for the Pistons. Like, I just don't see Trajan Langdon and that front office that's been preaching patience and not rushing things. I don't see them splurging to go pay Anthony Davis $70 million. I don't. And like I said to Asing 11, I don't think that Atlanta moving Kristaps' expiring contract is going to really get Dallas's interest peaked unless they're putting that Pelicans pick on the table. And I don't think Atlanta would want to do that for Anthony Davis. That will do it for our show today here on the Bleacher Report app and our latest NBA Insider video live stream notebook. We came to you Tuesday afternoon. This is going to be our new day moving forward as we march ever closer to February 5th. And we'll be talking to you next week, December 16th, when the December 15th window has opened and trade season will be here. Thank you guys for tuning in, and we will talk to you then. See you.